can development finance fix a fracturing global economy? That's the central question amid related questions that we're going to be discussing today in our conversation with Lawrence H. Summers and NK Singh. Larry Summers has served as U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Director of the U.S. National Economic Council, Chief Economist at the World Bank, and President of Harvard University, where he's currently President Emeritus and University Professor. NK Singh, Chairman of India's 15th Finance Commission, is President of the Institute of Economic Growth, a former Member of Parliament, and former Secretary to Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Larry Summers and NK Singh, great to have you on NDTV. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to provide some context first before we dive into our conversation. G20 members have unanimously accepted the recommendations on multilateral development banks made by an independent experts group appointed under the India G20 presidency. The report is titled Strengthening Multilateral Development Banks Through a Triple Agenda: Mandates, Finance, Mechanism. Volume 1 of the report was submitted ahead of the G20 meet in Delhi. Volume 2 is due in October. The expert group was co-convened by Larry Summers and NK Singh. And now we can dive straight into our conversation. Up front, Mr. Singh, for the benefit of our viewers, I think it's important to revisit what are multilateral development banks and why is it so important? Why are they so important to the world financial system?
Well, I think for several reasons. First and foremost, this difficult question of what is a multilateral development bank? Well, it's a bank which has been recognized and has really operations in several countries. It functions under the rules of an umbrella of transparent rules and functions. Right now, the number of multilateral development banks, we have sought to give an estimate in our first report. You would be surprised that there are 17 in number at the minimum and could be growing. But of course, by and large, we know that the major multilateral development banks is the World Bank Group, the largest in the family, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and variations thereon. They provide several important attributes. First of all, a long-term predictable source of financing. Second, functioning under rules which are transparent and which are known to everyone. But predictability, certainty, today constituting an important part of the entire external financing. As a family, in 2019, they provided $130 billion for concessional and non-concessional finance taken together. Our objective in the first report, which we have had the honor to present to the G20, is how to triple this 130, closer to 400 billion, and getting another 500 billion of private capital, all coming to $1 trillion, which when then added to 2 trillions of domestic resource mobilization meets approximately the kind of target of 3 trillions a year, which we believe would be necessary between now and 2030 to address the issues of climate change, transboundary challenges, issues of growing poverty, shared prosperity, and of course dealing with issues, as I said, of the enveloping global crisis on climate.
Well, you've set the context very neatly and nicely, but Larry Summers, I'm going to turn to you. You talk of a world on fire, and I think it's important to put all your thoughts on what you mean when you use that phrase, because that's the reality that is shaping and guiding this report on strengthening multilateral development banks. So if you could take a moment to expand on what you mean when you say we have a world on fire, literally and figuratively.
You're just right. We mean it literally and we mean it figuratively. Literally, millions of hectares has gone up in smoke. That's related to all kinds of natural disasters, many of which very likely trace back to global climate change, where we have the means to do things about it. Enormous progress has been made in renewable technology, but we don't yet fully have the will and the way. And that's why we think that in one crucial dimension, the provision of finance, the banks have such a huge obligation. But in a broader sense, this last year, these last 2 years, the world is facing a combination of challenges: climate change, pandemic threats. You know, the next COVID will probably come within 20 years. Fragile states overwhelmed by all the challenges that they are facing. Flows of refugees, the major war taking place now on the European continent, and the possibility of conflict elsewhere. Add all that up, and you have a set of profound challenges to human progress, surmountable challenges, but challenges that need to be surmounted. And that's why we speak of a world on fire, to convey both the gravity and the urgency of this moment.
So why is strengthening multilateral development banks or transforming them critical to dealing with the challenges that you have just described? What is the catalytic role that they can play?
So the phrase multilateral development banks doesn't light the imagination, but these are profoundly important institutions because they've got more capacity to move more money to more places than any other institution that man has ever invented. A dollar of guarantees provided by one sovereign country to a development bank can cost its budget much less than a dollar, because most of the loans are going to be repaid, and when received by the development bank, can be leveraged a number of times over. Indeed, $20 billion of capital provided to the World Bank has over time leveraged more than $800 billion of lending. So it's their power of leverage, it's their knowledge and capacity that make them such potent instruments. And they represent a forum for cooperation between nations. There are issues where nations are going to be in conflict. The United States and China are going to have tensions over many issues. India and Pakistan are going to have tension over many issues. But we all have a stake in the one planet that we share. We all have a stake in resisting global disease. None of us gain when poverty anywhere can become a source of instability everywhere.
Sure.
And that's why these are such important institutions, because their mission is so important and because they provide a forum for cooperation where cooperation is possible.
The underlying note, of course, that's coming through in your comments is that then these banks, these development banks, multilateral in nature, have not fully capitalized on their potential, and hence the need for strengthening them. And the report by the independent experts group, Mr. Singh, calls for action on 3 fronts. Could you briefly give us a sense of what those 3 buckets of action are that you're calling for?
Well, I think the 3 buckets of action: mandate is one bucket, financing is a second bucket, and modes of financing is a third. So if you look at the original charter of most of these multilateral development banks, they are the twin action. There is poverty, particularly extreme poverty, and second, shared prosperity. We add a third mandate, namely what we call the mandate, which Larry just explained, the current contemporary challenges: the climate, which is very important, fragility on health, issues of fragile states, some states in big debt, the war, the insecurity on account of food and fuel. And add to all this is really what we seek to address by significantly enhancing the capability of the multilateral development banks. As I mentioned, they have not yet fully harnessed the potential they have. In what way? First and foremost, in terms of being able to optimize the balance sheet in a more creative way. And we believe, in the recommendations which we have made, that harnessing what we call the Capital Adequacy Framework report, which was submitted earlier, will enable very substantial augmenting of the resources if we are able to recalibrate, for instance, the equity loan ratio, if you are able to harness guarantee structures, as Larry said, more creatively, above all, being able to harness private capital. What kind of policies and processes and procedures will enable, for instance, that currently, as Larry was pointing out, that in a 20 billion capitalization, more than 800 billion have been lent. It's a very high degree of leveraging. In sharp contrast to that, $1 has only secured 0.6 cents of private capital. That needs to fundamentally change in the new matrix which we have given. So, I think that we have given the prescription to try and address in a very contemporary sense the multiple complex challenges which we confront.
What does this mean? Again, our viewers are trying to understand this topic. As you said, multilateral development banks doesn't immediately light up or fire up everyone's mind, but I think it's an important area to understand. What does this mean in terms of donors? Do they have to commit more? I'm trying to understand how all the stakeholders are going to be supporting the report that you've made, and therefore donors play one piece.
I want to talk first about why everybody's got a stake in it. It means there'll be fewer typhoons that wash away land where hundreds of thousands of people live. It means fewer people will breathe air that has particulates in it and get lung diseases and die younger than they had to. It means that microbes will kill fewer of the world's older people the next time we have a pandemic. It means fragile states will have more of a chance to make a transition, as India has over the last 60 years, to join the modern world. And it doesn't mean any large cost. These are things that are profitable. Nowadays, it wouldn't have been true 10 years ago, but the miracle of technology means that it's cheaper many times to get electricity from the sun than from coal. It's cheaper to vaccinate a child than to treat that child when the child gets a deadly disease. And so this is about making investments with a high return. And ultimately, that's what's important about finance. What finance is about is bringing together those with capital and those with opportunity. And that's what every financial system does. But now there are opportunities and challenges at a global scale. Those are bigger than any one private institution is going to have the remit to take on. That's why we need global development banks, and that's why they need to be transformed for this new era.
Point taken, but I'm trying to understand how the report has been received in real terms as well, and whether there is a groundswell for it, because that will determine whether real progress will be set in motion. So what's your assessment?
Good and important question. We've been very encouraged. We thought when we wrote this report, we were going pretty far out on a limb in some ways by suggesting that these institutions be transformed, by talking about a trebling of financial commitment by 2030. We thought that this might well get dismissed and as impractical by people who hold office today as the dreams of former office holders and their friends. And we've been very much encouraged by the response of your finance minister, by the response of your prime minister, and by their leadership in the G20 as India has stepped up and delivered a statement unanimously of the G20 countries that goes forward quite far on the issues that we've been pushing. Now, that doesn't mean it's all done yet. The hard work is in the implementation, and some of the commitments are still a bit vague, but we're very encouraged by the progress that's been made.
Okay, I'm tempted to refer to a phrase that Larry Summers used recently, saying that, we have to go beyond coordinating to cooperate and cooperating to coordinate and really get down to the money and setting the wheels in motion, which is why, NK Singh, it's important to understand what happens next. What are the next steps? Volume 1 accepted, well received, unanimously accepted. Now there is Volume 2, and I understand that focuses more on timelines and actionables.
Well, Volume 1 has not been fully accepted. Volume 1 has received favorable response, as Larry pointed out, from different stakeholders. But there's a lot more which needs to be done. Volume 2 is keenly awaited. Both these figure in the Delhi Declaration. And the Volume 2 is going to really address some of the major issues which the G20 in the summit and in Gandhinagar on the 18th of July raised, when I had the privilege of presenting the report physically and Larry had come through an audiovisual. The second report, which we believe we have to give in time to be considered in Marrakesh at the time of the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank, and we will have the opportunity, both Larry and I, to present it physically to the finance ministers and governors of central bank of the G20 countries on the evening of the 12th of October, followed by further discussions on the 12th of October, and we hope that it will receive and have a reception as favorable, and the atmospherics are now much better than they were in July. Countries have moved, I wouldn't say decisively moved, but countries have certainly moved in a positive direction. There are many areas where there's hardly any disagreement.
Okay.
On harnessing of private capital, on the issue of guarantees, on the kind of variations of capital, hybrid, blended, and other forms of innovative finance, in terms of improving the operating model, in terms of improving the time and procedures from the concept note to the disbursement, in making not only them banks bigger, but better, and which stronger. Is very important, and bolder.
Okay. I know we have a time pressure on us, which is why I'm going to, Mr. Summers, fire a few questions at you. What are the key challenges you anticipate in adoption of the recommendations of the independent experts group?
Parliamentary, congressional groups have to vote in support of the commitment that governments have made. The banks have to transcend their orthodoxies and move with a speed to which they're not accustomed, and a boldness that has not been characteristic in the past.
U.S. leadership, because they're shifting geopolitics, and I imagine conceptually it affects the future of multilateralism and therefore of these banks. There is the U.S. leadership piece as well. Reflect on what I've just flagged off.
The United States has less capacity and less will to dictate or be a hegemon than it might have at some earlier stage. And so our task today is to work cooperatively with others. Most of the world's economic growth over the next 2 years and over the next 10 is going to come from what's been traditionally thought of as emerging markets. Question is whether they're going to be heard in the design of the global system. They certainly were heard in the authorship of our report, and whether they are heard or not in what ultimately happens is going to be very important for the ability to maintain connection around the world. I think President Biden understands that. He understands that we live in a world of coalitions, not a world in which any one country can dictate to all on all subjects.
Well put. I'm shifting gears a little bit, but it's impossible to have a conversation with you and not ask you on your assessment of China's economy currently, the US economy, and both those big pieces that affect the global economic outlook as well.
I think both economies have challenges. Fundamental strengths of the American economy, I think, are terrific. I think we are going to have a challenge of achieving a soft landing with respect to the inflation that we have had. I think that's not going to be an easy task for the Federal Reserve, but I think the dynamism of the American economy, its ability to accept immigrants different from most other economies, our strengths in creating the big technology companies, our ability to attract capital from all over the world means that I think the fundamental structure of the American economy is strong.
China?
I think China faces some very real challenges in the years ahead. Frankly, the most successful Chinese citizens are trying to take their money out of the country. Chinese parents are potential parents are not choosing to have children, and the birth rate is much lower than it was when they had a one-child family. And increasingly, the economy is being politicized as the party takes a stronger hand in so many parts of the economy. I think with these challenges and with the additional challenge represented by the tremendous problem China has of absorbing all of its savings, it can't go into exports anymore because the world won't take them. It can't go into infrastructure that much more because China's already built up a huge infrastructure. It had been going into real estate, but now China has empty cities. So that challenge is, I think, very serious. And so my guess is that these are not going to be easy years for China economically, and that the challenge for the Chinese is going to manage that with reform rather than managing it with heavy-handedness at home and truculence abroad.
You spent a lot of time in India recently, in recent months. So at the risk of running against the clock here, the Indian economy, how does your assessment of it sort of fit in with what you've described in the US and China?
India's economy is not yet nearly as large as that of the US or of China. But precisely because of that, India has immense potential to grow. I think with good fortune in the world economy, with boldness in economic reform, and with tremendous energy and effort by Indian workers and Indian businesses, one could imagine that by mid-century, India's economy would grow eightfold from its current status. 8 times as much economy as India has today, and that would change the lives of every Indian. And it couldn't happen without changing the world economy as India became that much more integrated with it. It's not my prediction for India because there are just too many obstacles and too many problems, but it is my hope for India, and it's part of a hope for a successful second quarter to the 21st century.
On that note, NK Singh, Larry Summers, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.